For today's lesson, we'll be looking at expanding algebraic expressions with negative factors. Our first example here is a negative 3 times the sum of x and 2. So we're going to take our outside factor, and this time it is a negative 3. And again, we multiply that by all parts inside. So when we expand here, we're going to use our distributive property, and that would show us a negative 3 times x plus a negative 3 times 2. When we simplify, negative 3 times x is a negative 3x, plus negative 3 times 2 is a negative 6. We have a negative 3x plus a negative 6, and just to clean that up, we're going to write it as negative 3x minus 6. Our second expression is a negative 5 times the difference of y and 2. And this expression here is a little different than the first one. In our first expression, we had plus on the inside as our operation, and for our second one, we have minus. So what we're going to do when we have a minus on the inside, I'm going to separate the terms on the inside. So I'll draw a line and I'll split. Anytime we hear a plus or minus, we know a new term is coming up. So our two terms on the inside are a positive y and a negative 2. So we'll take that negative 5 and multiply it by both of these parts. So that's a negative 5 times y plus a negative 5 times negative 2. So once we distribute, that leaves us with a negative 5y plus 10. In our second example, we're going to expand the expression negative 3 times the sum of a negative 2/3 a plus 1/5. So we'll again use our distributive property, and we're going to multiply this negative 3 by all parts inside. We'll start by setting it up as a negative 3 times a negative 2/3 a plus that same negative 3 times 1/5. And as a refresher, when we multiply an integer by a fraction, we could just take the integer and multiply it by the top part of the fraction, because another way of writing an integer as a fraction is just putting it over 1. So we multiply a negative times a negative here, and we know negative times negative is positive. And then 3 times 2 is 6/3 a plus a negative 3 times a positive 1/5 would give us a negative. So that would be plus a negative 3 times 1 on top here is a negative 3/5. We could simplify and clean this up a little bit. 6 divided by 3 gives us 2a, and instead of plus and negative, we'll just write that as minus 3/5. For our next example, you'll notice that we do not have an actual integer on the outside here. We just see a negative sign, and there's two different ways that we could look at this problem here, or look at this expression. So on the inside we had a negative 4/10 k minus 2 and 5/10. So the two ways that we could look at this is we could recall prior in the year that we talked about a negative sign meaning the opposite of. So we could say that this is the opposite of the difference of a negative 4/10 k and 2 and 5/10. So that negative sign means the opposite of, or we could also rewrite this as a negative 1 on the outside times the difference of 4/10 k minus 2 and 5/10. If we're looking at it the first way as the opposite of, what we could do on the inside here is just split both terms up. So we see both terms here, and I could start by looking at this here, and the opposite of a negative 4/10 k would be 4/10 k, And then the opposite of a negative 2 and 5/10 is a positive 2 and 5/10. So this would simplify to a 4/10 k plus 2 and 5/10. If we distributed with a negative 1 on the outside, we would end up with the same results here. A negative times a negative, that gives us our positive 4/10 k. And then we have plus, and then a negative times a negative again is a positive 2 and 5/10. For our last example, we have a negative 1/3 times the sum of p and 2q. So again, we would distribute here. Now we have a fractional coefficient on, or a fractional factor on the outside. So we have a negative fractional factor. So we would take this negative 1/3 and we would multiply it by p plus that same negative 1/3 times 2q. So we're multiplying the outside factor by both parts inside. P, when we have a variable by itself, that's just 1p, so anything times 1 is itself. So if we took a negative 1/3 times 1p, that would give us a negative 1/3 p. Another way you may see that is a negative p over 3. These two are the same things there. And then we're going to add it to a negative 1/3 times 2q. We could take that 2 and multiply it by the 1 on top, so that leaves us with a negative 2/3 q. And to clean that up, we'll just write it as a negative 1/3 p minus 2/3 q.